So how could we use a service in this application to improve it? Well, at the moment, we're using this app component to derive the investment results, and that of course means that data must be passed up from the user input component through a custom event, through an output to the app component. And it then must be passed down to the investment results through an input from that component, so from that app component. There's nothing wrong with this approach, but it's some extra code we have to write. Both the output as well as the input could actually be avoided if we used a service, and that's therefore what I'll do now. So what I'll do here is I'll add a service, maybe next to the app component. The exact position is not too important here, and I'll name it investment service. So the file is named investment.service.ts. And in there, as you learned it, we can and should export a class called investment service, which should be decorated with the @injectable decorator, which is imported from @Angular core. And to that decorator, you pass a configuration object where you should set provided into root. This will make sure that Angular is able to inject that service and that components can request that service to be injected. Now, inside of this service, I now want to gather the data entered by the user and derive those results. So what we could do here in this service is take that code from our app component, this onCalculateInvestmentResults method here, cut it and remove it from the app component, and add it to the investment service. Though I'll rename it to calculate investment results, since it will no longer be directly bound to a custom event. But that's just a naming thing. Now I want to still use that custom investment input data type, which is imported from that model file, like this. And of course, we must make sure that we still store the results data, either with a signal or with a regular property. And again, I'll show you both. Now let's start by not using a signal, but instead by using a regular property. For that, we can add a property to that investment service, and we could name it result data, just as before. So of course, then we should also go back to the app component and grab this data type here. And now we can and should also get rid of the signal here, of this results data signal, and get rid of all these imports which we no longer need, so that the app component or this entire file is now much leaner again. In the investment service, we should set the type of result data to this type here, though it can initially be undefined, hence this question mark. And now, of course, in this method, in this calculate investment results method, we should set this result data to this annual data that is derived here. So with that, we now got this method in this service, and we got a property which will eventually hold the result of this method here, of this calculation. Now we can and should use this investment service in the files that need to interact with it. For example, in the user input component TypeScript file. There, instead of setting up this output, which should be removed therefore, and hence you can and should also remove this output function import and this unneeded import. Instead of using that output, we can and should now reach out to that service here in onSubmit. Therefore, of course, we must make that service available, and one way of doing that is with help of this constructor function, where you can inject that service with help of Angular by adding a parameter with any name of your choice. For example, investment service. And by setting the type to investment service, so to your service class name. And for that, of course, you must import this service class from this investment service TypeScript file. This syntax here, this code, will tell Angular that it should inject an instance of this investment service as a value for this investment service parameter into this constructor function. And since I need access to that injected service here in this onSubmit method, we then need to store this parameter in a property of this class. And you can easily do this by using a shortcut that's provided by TypeScript. By simply adding the public or private keyword in front of this parameter, a new property with that name will be created in this component. And here we can use private because I don't need to use this service anywhere else. I don't need to access it in the template or anything like that. So with that, a property of this name here will be created and added to the class, and it will hold such a service instance. Therefore, here in onSubmit, we can and should now use this investment service property and then reach out to that service class instance and call calculate investment results. Well, and now we can and should pass this data object here to calculate investment results. And we can and should get rid of this calculate emit call here. So that's how we now trigger this service method when the form is submitted from inside this user input component. Now we're interested in our calculation result, so in that result data here, in the investment results component. So in this file, we should now actually remove this input and remove this input import, and also inject that service here so that we get access to the same service class instance that we used for calculating the results here in this component to get the results. Now we can again inject this service instance with help of the constructor or by using this other approach I showed you, where you can add a property with any name of your choice. And the value of that property is the result of calling the inject function that's provided by Angular. And to inject, you pass your service class name like this. For that to work, you must import both inject as well as your service class. Now with that, we got the service available here. Now to expose it to the template, or to expose the results to the template, we could add a getter called results. And then here simply return this investment service dot result data. To expose that result data from that service through that getter to the template of this component. Now in the investment results component HTML file, results is no longer a signal, so we need to remove those parentheses, but other than that, it should work just as before. And that is indeed all. That is how you could use a service to communicate between those components. With those changes made, you should now also go to the app component template and of course get rid of this event binding here. Since app user input does no longer emit this calculate event, it no longer has this output. And you must get rid of this results binding since app investment results, this component here, no longer wants this input. With that, if you save that and you reload the application, if you enter some input here, like this, and you click calculate, you should again see the same kind of results as before, but now they're generated and sent between those components, so to say, with help of a service. And as you can tell, that led to a leaner app component and to less code in both the user input and the investment results components. Now, of course, we can also build this service by using a signal in there for managing that data instead of using a property. And you would do that by assigning a value to result data, a value that will be the result of calling signal. And for that, of course, you must import this signal function from Angular core. And you must remove this question mark and this type annotation here, since result data will now always hold such a signal. But it will be a signal that holds an undefined value at the beginning and eventually will hold the result data. Now, you saw before how you can set that data appropriately here. You can add angle brackets and then add the type of data that will eventually be stored by that signal, but also optionally accept undefined as a value, since that is our starting value here. So that's how we can use a signal here. With that signal added, we can go to the bottom of this calculate investment results function here and update it by calling set, though the name of the property is now result data. Now that's all you need to do here in this service. We don't need to change anything in the user input component, but we do need to change something in the investment results component now. Because result data is now a signal, so our getter here now returns a signal. So in the template, we again need to execute this function to read the signal value and set up this subscription. In addition, you could consider changing the code here a little bit, and instead of setting up a getter like this, which would work, you could also instead create a computed value by calling the computed function that's provided by Angular core. And then to this function, you pass a function that returns the computed value. And here I want to reach out to this investment service result data and execute that, since this is a signal. With that, results still returns a signal just as it did before, but it no longer directly returns the writable signal from inside the service, but instead a computed read-only signal. And with this pattern, you therefore make sure that you don't accidentally change the data managed by the service from outside the service, which you could do if you were directly interacting with the result data. As an alternative, you could also omit this computed function and not call it. And instead, you can directly store the signal provided by the service in this results property. Though there's a little twist, you should call as read-only on that signal. As read-only is a method provided by Angular, which you can call on signals to get a read-only version of those signals, which can't be manipulated. So this is therefore simply an alternative to using the computed function we used before. It's up to you which approach you prefer. Here I'll go back to computed so that we see that function in action again as well, but you could also use the more concise as read-only method I just showed you. With that, if you save that and reload again, if you again enter some data, this is still calculated just as before, but now with help of a signal in this service.